Welcome to Tactical Talk. This is Zain. False flag describes covert operations that are designed to deceive in such a way that operations appear as though they are being carried out by entities, groups, or nations other than those who are actually planning and executing them. Some are basically terror attacks carried out by countries upon themselves to start a war with another country. To discuss this topic, we have with us today a Hollywood actor, film producer, and director, Sean Stone. Sean is also the son of the legendary Hollywood film producer, director, Oliver Stone. Sean is also a talk show host and a geopolitical commentator on many different media channels. Welcome to our show, Sean Stone. This is Zain Khan. It's a pleasure to have you on Tactical Talk.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Sean, let's get to the first question. Let's talk about geopolitics. I've always wondered that whenever everything is going right, there's suddenly a shooting or a bomb blast which suddenly turns into a certain warmongering narrative, which requires action. Do you think some of them are false flags? What are false flags and what do they achieve?
Right. Of course, I mean, the false flags, historically, they're known to have occurred. I believe they still occur. Basically, it comes from this whole notion of during the age of piracy, pirate ships would fly the flag of certain nations, even though they weren't necessarily belonging to that nation. So maybe the British had a pirate fleet, for example, like Francis Drake was a famous pirate who was working for the British Empire. And so if they want to, let's say, attack like a Dutch ship, they can fly the flag of the Spanish. So then the Dutch think the Spanish are attacking them when it's actually the British behind it. That's why they call it false flags. So the idea is oftentimes you see terror attacks that occur, and it will be blamed on ISIS, or it can be blamed on some other jihadist group, whether, like Al-Qaeda or Lebanon. And then it seems like it may not have actually been that group that was ultimately organizing the conspiracy of that attack. So that's when you get this notion of like a false flag event. And I don't know that it necessarily, with every bombing that we're seeing or like attack, I don't know that it's always coming in when things are all right or quiet. I would say the one time that did seem to occur to me recently was with the Orlando shooting, because it came at the end of that week when Muhammad Ali had passed away, and there was a lot of good feeling around Islam because of Muhammad's choice to basically embrace Islam in his course of his life. And then at the end of that week, after he'd passed, the great spokesman had passed, then there's this mass shooting at the homosexual club, and of course it's assumed that this one guy did all the shooting, and to me, there's a lot of indication that one guy doesn't pull off that kind of massacre by himself, and there's some issues with the tweets about the timing of the event and why it took police so long to get in, and if someone that was actually alleged to be barricading the door, so he might have had accomplices. So there's a lot of issues with just that one event. Obviously, every one, you can go into detail. I'm not an expert on each event, but I can say that you always have to ask questions, because it's the nature of Central Intelligence and the various intelligence agencies to want to create a narrative of who's behind the attack that fits into what they're trying to perpetuate. And it's the same with the Syria war, for example, where every time a chemical weapon attack goes off, it's always blamed on Assad, because Assad is supposed to be the bad guy, when in fact we're supporting the Al-Qaeda and other terrorist elements that are in the country, and that's clearly known at this point. But moderate or legitimate group, and oftentimes it does seem the chemical weapons are actually coming from these groups, but we're basically trying to blame the chemical weapons attacks on Assad. So that's another false flag that serves the agenda of trying to overthrow this president who, yes, he might be a dictator, but ultimately has kept the country, Syria, until the civil war, in much better shape than most countries in the Middle East, and now it's completely collapsed into chaos and terror.
Sean, are false flags done by different countries through their own agencies to promote a warmongering narrative?
Well, sure. So we know, I would say, first of all, I would argue that there are no terrorist groups that are not state-sponsored. Every terrorist group needs some form of state to allow for weapons shipments, things like oil deals through. So there's all kinds of state-backed, state organization that's required for a terror group to operate. It can't simply, they can't just operate in the sewers or in the desert of a country. They need supply lines, right? They need to pay people. They need money for weapons. They need to be able to sell, whether it's drugs or oil or some kind of contraband. So all this requires a sort of state backing to allow these terror groups to operate. So ultimately, the question then becomes, who are the states that are supporting groups, and could it also be part of a talking about Gladio, for example, it was sort of known as Gladio, and it was basically part of this NATO false flag operations that were taking place all through the Cold War, where NATO, North American Treaty Organization, has a military command component to it, and they were working against the Soviets or the Russians, and oftentimes they would use left-wing groups or simply right-wing groups. But either way, the idea was to create explosions, shooting incidences, bombings, to basically create fear and panic in Western Europe, blame it then on the communists, left-wing groups, and basically use that to clamp down either with more of a police state agenda or sometimes to shift elections away from the liberal candidates to more right-wing candidates. And this was known, this has been studied, people can research the history on this, and this is taking place all throughout the Cold War. So people speculate, why couldn't Gladio still be occurring through the Middle East?
Sean, have you ever interviewed an intelligence operative who has ever done a false flag?
No. To my knowledge, I've never interviewed an intelligence operative who's come out and said he's done a false flag. I do remember an interview with John Banks on Buzzsaw, which is really a fascinating interview. People should watch it. But Banks basically was a British intelligence, I wouldn't say an officer, but he worked in British intelligence basically in the murky. It gets very murky in the intelligence world because oftentimes you'll be sort of, assigned to like a military function, and then you'll be, sort of recruited or contracted to work for an agency, but you may not officially belong to that agency. So it gets very, murky when you get into black operations because they need a lot of deniability. So with John Banks, he told me his story, which was that he was operating in South Africa against Al-Qaeda down there, and that he was witnessing basically how the intelligence services were allowing these guys to operate with their deals, basically for all kinds of financial deals that were taking place, I think around diamonds, but I'm not positive. And then that Al-Qaeda basically, their operatives were planning certain events to take place, including attacks in the United States. And basically, John just kept seeing how these people and these Al-Qaeda guys were being monitored and basically allowed to move and to do certain things. Now, in that case, ultimately the events were shut down. But you can imagine, given his information he provided, and again, people can watch the interview for themselves, how an event like this can occur where you get basically people monitoring, whether it's FBI, CIA, British intelligence, Mossad, all kinds of agencies that are monitoring these terrorists. Because again, there's people might believe that terrorists can just operate off the grid completely, but it's just not realistic. Terrorists don't function out of sewers, out of caves, out of deserts. They operate with supply lines. They operate basically under certain auspices of political and political affiliations. So they're always known to the various intelligence services and police forces in any region. So that's why it's easy to monitor these guys. And I think what happens at a certain level is that they basically get the pass. Like you go back to '93 with the World Trade Center bombing, the FBI informant basically kept telling the FBI that that these guys wanted to do an attack. They wanted to hit the World Trade Center, and the FBI basically told the informant, "Go ahead, go ahead, go ahead." And he kept saying, "But we're going to switch out the bomb, right? We're going to switch out the bomb with a fake one." And the FBI basically just said nothing to that. So ultimately, the bombing took place in '93. It was a smaller bombing. Obviously, didn't take the towers down, but the FBI's fingerprints are all over it because of their informant, who was constantly giving information about the terror cell and the operation and the plot. And it raises that whole question of whether or not many of these attacks are really being monitored, and then at a certain point, someone in the intelligence community either says, "Okay, go ahead with it," or "shut it down." And again, that would ultimately motivate certain political decisions, because you can then create, you can pass legislation, a warfare state, you can create a more national security state as a result of these attacks. And most Americans, or most people in the West, can't imagine that anyone in their own power structure would want to see people get killed. But I'm sorry, that's the nature of power. Power is predicated on murdering populations and basically moving them around or manipulating them for purposes of maintaining its power.
Sean, last question. Tell us a little bit about your new book, New World Order. What does it talk about, and where could we order it when it's out?
Yeah. So, I mean, speaking of this last issue about the power structure and how the power structure works, um, I was studying at Princeton for my senior thesis. I was studying Henry Kissinger's mentor at Harvard, this man named William Yandell Elliott. Elliott basically is like a quintessential Anglo-American imperialist, someone who came from the South of the United States, became a Rhodes Scholar, studied with basically the heirs of the British Roundtable movement, and adapted their foreign policy and their perspective, which was the British Roundtable basically were like the last round of British imperialists in the late 19th, early 20th century who realized the British Empire won't last because basically it's hated around the world by the people we occupy. It's financially bankrupt. And all these. Remember, the British Empire encompassed a quarter of the world at that time. So they said, look, we can't maintain this empire. We have to turn it into a commonwealth. We have to make people believe that ultimately we're working towards the greater good of all of them, right? That we're working for their best interests. And we're using international laws, international finance to basically create those conditions to improve the lot of everyone in the empire. So that concept of the British Commonwealth is what was adopted. And the plan, of course, was to reincorporate America into that Commonwealth. So people like Eliot basically became the heirs intellectually of that tradition. And he came back to the U.S. and he worked very closely with the Rockefeller Foundation and advised like 6 presidents, for example, and then trained people at Harvard like Kissinger and Brzezinski and Sam Huntington and many others in this worldview, which is really an imperial worldview, to say that nation states have to go. We cannot have nation states or constitutional sovereignty over a territory. We have to ultimately adapt to this greater empire of the mind, of military power, of extensions of balance of power, of force abroad, and ultimately this whole new empire will be brought together under certain international laws, international treaties, and international finance. But ultimately, the heart and the head of these treaties and whatnot would still be the United States and England, sort of driving the new empire, this new Anglo-American empire. So that's really where this concept of the New World Order came from, and there were a lot of intellectuals World Order at the end of World War II, early Cold War. So we kind of trace the intellectual history of the New World Order in the 20th century from the perspective of these elitists coming out of, again, the Anglo-American tradition and what they were trying to create as far as, to this point, it would seem, what they're trying to create as far as like sort of ending American constitutional sovereignty and putting America in this position where we are now of being the policeman of the world, of being sort of obliged under international treaties and laws to lose its sense of sovereignty and economic sovereignty and moving more towards a new international order and framework that many people, of course, would say is good. It's liberalizing things. It's making trade easier. Globalization is a positive thing. But I would argue that it also hurts many people on the domestic front in America from the perspective of losing their sovereignty over their economic situation. Most people are now put into a situation of massive debt as opposed to, because of the financial power that's been created by this new economic system, the banks have become so powerful that they basically are putting everyone into a situation where we don't make as much as we used to, but we all basically are enslaved by our credit cards. And so this is sort of some of the things that are looked at in the book, and it's called New World Order, and it's coming out this fall, actually, in October. People can get it on Amazon, and it's a pretty heavy read.
Thank you so much, Sean Stone, for being on Tactical Talk. It was a pleasure having you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
This was Sean Stone, a Hollywood actor and film producer. We discussed the concept of false flag operations. Until the next episode of Tactical Talk, this is Zain Khan. Take care and goodbye.